Today I'm going to give you 15 reasons why I won't live in Southeast Asia ever again. Some of those reasons are also going to apply to your life, so stick around. Whenever you go to Asia, you tend to pay a lot more for a service, for a product, than a local person does. It's the foreigner factor, right? You're coming to the tropics, you're coming to Thailand, you're coming to Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, whatever country you decide to choose, you end up paying more than the locals, be it for tours, be it for certain events. Not always, but it often happens. So don't be disappointed, don't be upset if you end up paying more than a local. It's just how the game works. Southeast Asia is pretty anti-animal. What do I mean by that? Well, if you've ever been to Thailand and you ended up on an elephant, you might very likely know what it took to train the animal. Animals, they really have to undergo a lot to actually perform. They are being tortured. It's not what I stand for. And so for me personally, that is a no-go. And shows, tours, animal performances is just one thing. The other side of the equation is, of course, that if you take a look at a dog, if you want to own a dog, if you want to own a pet, Southeast Asia is pretty anti-animal. If you want to fly, let's say from Ho Chi Minh City to Thailand, you cannot take your pet with you in the cabin. That is not an option. And the same also holds true for dog parks. There are very few dog parks in Thailand where you can walk your dog. So I find it really difficult to accept this mentality. And again, this is not just about the shows, it's not just about the tours, it's not just about performances, it is not just about walking your dog on the streets of Bangkok. It is also about renting a condominium. Whether you're able to keep your dog in a condominium or not, and whether you're able to walk your dog freely without having to worry about somebody criticizing you because you have a dog. People there are not so open when it comes to animals. It just is not as developed. The mindset is just not there. Even though the younger generations are changing, it's still not changing fast enough to really make it worthwhile for a pet owner. Another big reason is prostitution. There is a lot of prostitution all over Asia. Now, if you're a single guy, single woman living in the region, it will most likely not affect you. But should you move to Southeast Asia along with your family, so if you're a family of 3, a family of 4, and you want to live in Southeast Asia, the question is whether you want to be confronted with prostitution 24/7. Is this the type of environment that you would want to raise your kids in? A very important question. Education is a big problem in the region. Those countries have a very low education standard, and it creates problems all over the place. When it comes to etiquette, everything in life starts with education. The earlier you are being educated, whether that's by your parents, whether that's by an institution, the greater the chances, the greater your chances of being educated, of being intelligent, of being thoughtful, mindful, of having good etiquette. And if you haven't received that education, that foundation, chances are, you may never develop it, or it's going to take decades and decades and decades for you to develop it. Freedom of speech is another big con, another reason why I won't live in Southeast Asia ever. Again, we've seen this during the COVID-19 pandemic, that foreigners were not allowed to open up their mouths against anything. The government, they are not allowed to protest. A foreigner, unless he's a citizen, but once a foreigner has become a citizen of a Southeast Asian country, the foreigner no longer is a foreigner. The foreigner is a local citizen. But unless you obtain citizenship, which is another problem we're going to talk about here in a moment, you're always going to be the foreigner, and you're never going to have freedom of speech. And even if you are local in a place like Thailand, you are still not allowed to exercise freedom of speech. Thailand is a monarchy, and the monarchy forbids any type of criticism against the monarch and the monarch's family. No land ownership. And I've talked to people, and there are a lot of people who are nomads, they're remote workers, and they're like, hey, land ownership is not so important to me. I don't want to own a land in Southeast Asia. I don't want to become a citizen. So for me, owning land is not a big deal. I just want to rent. However, what those people don't consider is, let's say something goes horribly wrong in their home country, and potentially they could end up in a situation when they lose their passport, or when they lose certain perks, certain privileges. If that should happen, then what are you going to do? What are those people going to do? Unless you have permanent residency, or at least temporary residency, which can later on be converted into permanent residency, you're always going to remain an alien. You're always going to remain the foreigner. As Southeast Asian governments and countries are becoming richer, they are going to want more rich people, more rich foreigners. They want to attract people with more money, and we are already seeing this all over the place. Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam. So it is already happening. So when it comes to having like a long-term plan, the question is, are you able to own land or not? Because if not, then maybe you're never going to have a home unless you're satisfied with an apartment. No company ownership. Yes, that is true in many places where you as a foreigner cannot own a company. Thailand is such a place. Now I could argue, well, Americans are allowed to own a company in Thailand. They are allowed to own 100% of a company, and that is correct. But what about citizens of other nations who are not allowed to own 100% of a Thai company? They don't have any other choice than to either A, hand 50% of the company over to a local person who they may know or may not know. B, don't start a company. Or C, do it potentially with their wives. Citizenship, it is very difficult to impossible to become a citizen of many Southeast Asian countries. Now people argue, well, you can become a citizen of Thailand, you can become a citizen of the Philippines. That is true, but those countries, they don't allow dual citizenship. Question is, are you willing to give up your current passport in order to obtain a passport in a place like Thailand or the Philippines? Malaysia is the same too. Those countries do not allow dual citizenship. So if you want to become a citizen of their country, you must surrender your current citizenship. Same also holds true for Vietnam. Think about that for a moment. If you want to wait decades and decades and decades for a Southeast Asian passport to become stronger, to have more international potential, okay, great. You might find a point. But what if you don't want to wait? What if you still want to have special travel privileges, meaning visa-free access to most countries? A Thai passport is not going to cut it. A Vietnamese passport is not going to cut it. A Filipino passport, a Philippines passport is not going to cut it. So you're not in a very good situation. Low food safety is another issue. You go out to eat and you end up with food poisoning, or you catch diarrhea. It happens many times to many people who live in Southeast Asia, and even people who just travel in Southeast Asia, it happens to them as well. There isn't a whole standard in place for food safety. You could argue, well, some countries, they have a regulatory authority that regulates the food, but is the regulation really at the same standard? Bad hospitals, another big point. Now people argue, well, there are great hospitals in Bangkok, Manila, Kuala Lumpur. All right, but what if you don't want to live in those cities? What if you don't want to be just 30, 60 minutes away from those cities? What if you want to live in a smaller city? What if you want to live somewhere more rural? What are you going to do? Hospitals in Southeast Asia are really only good in the bigger cities. And a lot of people don't talk about that, and retirees and expats, they usually don't figure that out until they end up with severe health issues that leave them no other choice than to go back home to receive medical treatment. The climate. Well, not every person wants to live in the tropics. It sounds like a great idea, to live in the tropics, to have high humidity, to have good weather throughout the year. And I agree with that. Tropical weather, especially in a big city, can be an issue. High humidity and high temperatures, very often reduce your life expectancy. It's not everything, you know, because if you take a look at Singapore, you can definitely see that a country, I shouldn't say a country because it really isn't a country, it's a jurisdiction, a low tax jurisdiction, has one of the highest life expectancies in the entire world. There's no question about that. The data proves it. However, you also have to consider that Singapore enjoys a great healthcare system, also great education, you know, great food standards, right? So it's not just about the climate, but it's about many other things. So if you're a person who loves multiple seasons, if you're a person who loves cooler climate, then maybe Southeast Asia is not for you, because there are very few, if any, exceptions. Some exceptions include Dalat, Vietnam, northern Vietnam. Some exceptions include Genting Highlands, Malaysia, potentially northern Thailand, right? But then we're pretty much done with the exceptions. Global warming is another reason. You know, the planet is getting hotter, and this is not a conspiracy theory, that is actually proven. In Kuala Lumpur, you know, the temperature has increased almost 2 degrees over the past decades, almost 2 degrees. So think about it, if it gets another 2 to 5 degrees hotter in the next 50 to 100 years, would you really want to live in Kuala Lumpur? And you could argue, well, you spend most of the day indoors anyway. Yeah, but then again, that leads to a whole other set of problems, you know, lack of fresh air, you know, or not being able to exercise outdoors. And how it works in tropical cities like Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, the people who actually do go biking or do play tennis, you know, they go biking, you know, in the mornings or the evenings, you know, once the sun's set, you know, or they just play tennis indoors. The time zone is not a big issue. So people who work with, you know, North America, who work with Europe, those people are remote workers. They work with North America and Europe, which means that they have to adjust their schedule in order to fit in, because the companies, you know, in North America and Europe, they're not going to adjust to your needs. You know, if you work with clients, you got to be on the clock. Now you could argue, well, I'm a freelancer and, you know, that doesn't apply to me. That's perfectly fine. It doesn't apply to every person, but it applies to many people. It applied to me at the time when I worked with clients from North America, and I really had to adjust because I had to work until the early mornings. And I did it for a couple of years, and it drained my health. You know, I made good money, but it was not something that I'd be willing to do again. Scams. There are a lot of scams all over Southeast Asia. When we're talking about visa scams, you know, companies promising you to help you get a long-term visa. And, you know, if you have fallen victim to one of the visa scams, you definitely know what I'm talking about. And it's not just about visa scams, it's also about dating scams, marriage scams, love scams. Because coming into a country, you know, that's pretty poor, you know, meaning median income per capita is much lower than it is back home. You know, you have a big target on your back, and chances are you might get scammed. And that is something that a lot of people don't see. They ignore it. They think, oh, I found the love of my life. Well, there is a reason why somebody would want to be with you and not a local person. I've stressed this already many times throughout my videos. So there are a couple of precautions that you can take. You can limit the amount of money that you spend. And I think if you're a man, it is your responsibility to provide for your woman and your family. So I'm not denying that. But I don't want to see Western people get scammed out of money by their wives just because they weren't cautious enough, and just because they didn't have a budget in place, they didn't have a good set of rules in place. There are many things that you can do to avoid getting scammed. Air pollution, another big issue in the bigger cities. Air pollution, you know, if you live in an environment with air pollution long enough, there is almost a 100% guarantee that your life expectancy decreases as a result of living in a place with high air pollution for many, many years, or even many, many decades. So it's not just about, hey, I can stay indoors, or I avoid exercising outdoors, or it's just, you know, during certain seasons. Trust me, if you live in a place with high air pollution for many, 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 many years or many decades, then your health will deteriorate. And I wanted to give you also another reason why. That's actually a bonus reason, and that is there are too many gringos in Southeast Asia these days. If you take a look at the Philippines, you take a look at Thailand, if you walk down certain streets or certain neighborhoods, you see a tremendous amount of foreigners living there. And I want to feel a little bit different. You know, I don't want to be surrounded by my own social grouping, you know, that I had back home. I actually want a place that feels more authentic. And most foreigners who move to Southeast Asia, they actually end up living in places that are more westernized than local, because the only way that they can live in those places, they need the Western standards. So it's actually not that they're living in Southeast Asia. They pretend to be living in Southeast Asia, yet, you know, they're living in a place that feels actually much more like home because of unwillingness to adjust, because of, you know, wanting a certain standard. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can want a certain standard, and you can certainly have it in Southeast Asia's cities. But what I'm saying is there are just too many gringos in Southeast Asia these days. But there are exceptions. There are plenty of areas with fewer gringos, and those areas you gotta find for yourself. Which of the discussed reasons represents the biggest point for you? Leave a comment below and let us know. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. I'm uploading new videos on digital nomad locations, travel updates, and investment advice several times a week right now. And if you got some more time left, check out these videos.